Welcome to my channel Sleep Audio Stories. Thank you for watching. Video, subscribe, and like my channel.
Goodbye, Dead Man by Tom W. Harris. Mattup had killed a man, so it was logical he should be punished. It was Danny who came up with the idea of leaving him with the prophecy. Goodbye, Dead Man by Tom W. Harris. It was Orly Mattup's killing of the old lab technician that really made us hate him. Mattup was a guard at the reactor installation at Bayless, Kentucky, where my friend Danny Hearn and I were part of the staff when the outsiders took everything over. In what godforsaken mountain hole they had found Mattup, and how they got him to sell out to them, I don't know. He was an authentic human, though. You can tell an outsider. Mattup and Danny and I were playing high-low jack the night Uncle Pete was killed, sitting on the wide walk where Mattup had a view of the part of the station he was responsible for. High-low jack is a backcountry card game. Danny had learned it in northern Pennsylvania, where he came from, and Mattup loved the game. And they had taught it to me because the game is better three-handed. The evening session had been Danny's idea. I think he figured it might give him a line on Mattup. On the night in question, Mattup was on a week's losing streak and was in a foul humor. He was superstitious, and he had called for a new deck twice that evening and walked around his seat 4 different times. His bidding was getting wilder. "You'd better cool down," Danny told him. "Thing to do is ride out the bad luck, not fight it." Orly picked his nose and looked at his cards. "Bid 4, he growled. 4 is the highest possible bid. Tim played his cards well, and he had good ones. He had sewed up 3 of his points when we heard somebody moving around down at the reactor floor. It was old Uncle Pete Barker, one of the technicians. "What do you want down there?" bawled Mattup. "Just left my cap by the control room," said Uncle Pete, "and thought I'd go and get it." "You keep the hell away from there," grunted Mattup. Uncle Pete stopped and stood gazing up at us. We went on playing. It was the last card of the hand, and would either win the game for Mattup or lose it for him. Orly slapped his card down. It was a critical card, the jack. Danny took it with a queen, and Mattup had lost the game. I felt like clearing out. Mattup's face was purple, and his eyes looked like wolves' eyes. He glared at Danny, making a noise in his throat, and then I saw his gaze leave Danny and go to something down by the reactor. It was Uncle Pete, shuffling toward the control room. Mattup didn't say a word. He stood up and unholstered the thing the outsiders had given him and pointed it at Uncle Pete. There was a ringing in our ears, and Uncle Pete began to twist. Something inside him twisted him, twisting inside his arms, his legs, head, trunk, even his fingers. It was only for a few seconds. Then the ringing stopped, and Uncle Pete sunk to the ground, and there was silence and the smell. Mattup made us leave the body there until we had played 2 more hands. Danny won 1. He was a man with good nerves. When we went back to our room, he said, "That did it. I'm going to get that guy." "I hate his big guts," I said, buttoning my pajama shirt. "But how are you going to get him?" "I'll get him," said Danny. "Meanwhile, we'll keep playing cards." Things went on almost normally at the Bayless reactor. It was a privately owned pool-type reactor, and we were sent samples of all sorts of materials for irradiation from all over the country. Danny was one of the irradiation men. I generally handled controlling. The outsiders had filled the place with telescreens and guards, and all the mail was opened. But there was no real interference with the work. I began to worry a little about Danny. Almost every afternoon he spent an hour alone in our room, with the door closed. Madame kept getting worse. An animal with power. He used to go hunting with that damnable outsider weapon, although the meat killed with it wasn't fit to eat. And he used it on birds until there wasn't one left anywhere near the plant. He never killed a bluebird, though. He said it was bad luck. Sometimes he drank moonshine corn liquor, usually alone, because the outsiders wouldn't touch it. But sometimes he made some of us drink with him, watching sharply to see that we didn't poison him, and craftily picking his nose. When he was drunk, he was abusive. One night we were in our room, dead for sleep after a long game, and Danny said, "Let me show you something." He shuffled the cards. I cut, and he dealt me an ace, king, queen, jack, 10, and deuce of spades. He shuffled again, and dealt me the same in hearts. "Watch as closely as you can," he grinned. "See if you can catch me." I couldn't. "I've been practicing," he said. "I'm gonna get Madame." What good will it do to beat him in cards? You'll only make him sore. I was relieved to learn what Danny had been doing alone in our room, but this card-sharp angle didn't make much sense to me. "Who says I'm going to beat him at cards?" smiled Danny. "By the way, did you hear the rumor? They're going to break up the staff. Outsider policy. Send us to Oak Ridge, Aragon, Shippingport. Send new people down here." "That doesn't leave you much time," I said. "Time enough," said Danny. The next night, Madame began a fantastic streak of luck. It seemed he couldn't lose, and he was as unpleasant a winner as he was a loser. "You boys don't know what card playing is," he'd gloat. "Think you're pretty smart with all that science stuff, but you can't win a plain old card game. You know why you can't beat me, boys?" "Because you're too smart, I guess," said Danny. "Well, yeah, and something else. I dip my hands in spunk water, up on the mountain where you can never find it. And besides that, I spit on every card in the deck, and wiped it off. Can't lose now for saving my life." "Maybe you're right," said Danny, and went on dealing. A few days later, the rumor of moving was confirmed. I was being sent to Oak Ridge, Danny to Aragon. Madame kept winning and suggested that we raise the stakes. By the day we were to leave, we owed him every cent we had. I paid up soberly. I wouldn't give Madame any satisfaction by complaining. It looked as though Danny wasn't going to get Madame after all. But Danny surprised me. "Look, Buster," he wheeled. "If I pay you $75, I won't have a cent left. How about me paying half now and the rest later?" "No good," said Madame. "You got it. Pay me. If you can't pay cash, give me your watch. I know you got one." "Look, Buster, quit calling me Buster. What am I going to live on until I get paid again? What do I care?" It went on like that until the buses for the airport were nearly ready to leave, and both men seemed angry enough to kill each other. "Let's go," I begged Danny. "Pay him and leave." "All right then," Danny snapped, and pulled out his wallet. He counted out all his bills into Madame's hands. "You're $1 short," said Madame. "Why not forget the buck?" said Danny. "You can spare it." "You're $1 short," repeated Madame, scowling. Danny dashed his wallet to the ground. "You're even taking my change." He got his jacket from the back of the chair—it was a hot day—and emptied the change from the side pocket. There were 2 quarters and a $half, and he paid them over. "I've got 11 cents left," he said. "Hell, take that too. I don't give a damn." Mattup grinned. "Sure, I'll take it, if you weren't lying when you said I could have it." "It'll break me," said Danny. "I know it," said Mattup. "Gonna break your promise?" The bus driver was honking. "The hell with you," said Danny to Mattup, and gave him a dime and a penny. He looked Mattup in the eye with a strange expression. "Now, I give you that, and you didn't win it. You took it of your own free will. I offered it, and you took it, right?" "Right," said Mattup. "Sucker." We scrambled on the bus, and as it pulled away, Danny yelled, "Hey, Buster, look!" Mattup looked, and Danny stuck his right arm out the window, pointing at Mattup with his right forefinger, and his little finger stuck out straight and parallel, the thumb tucked under. A strange, disturbed look came over Orley. He turned his back as the bus roared out of the drive. At the airport, Danny popped into a phone booth and got Orley on the line. Nobody seemed to care, either outsiders or guards, and he let me listen. "Spend your money yet, dead man?" heard Danny. "What you mean, dead man?" gruffed Orley's voice. "You crazy or something?" "You know that 11 cents extra you took?" gloated Danny. "It's gonna kill you, Buster, for killing Uncle Pete, and for everything else you've done. I know. I've been talking nice to Uncle Pete. You're a dead duck, Orley Mattup. Dead." I don't believe it. It's baloney. I'm going to spend the 11 cents and get rid of it." "You do exactly that, Buster. I locked the curse on it, and I made the sign on you, and you have to keep that 11 cents for the rest of your life. If you spend it, or if you lose it, and you will lose it, that's the end of you." "I'll come out there and pound the hell out of you," yelled Mattup. "Too late, Buster. Our planes are leaving. Goodbye, dead man." And we had to run for our planes. Danny's pitch sounded pretty weak to me, even though Orley was superstitious. But I didn't get to tell Danny that until 5 years later. "I think I got him," said Danny. "You don't know the whole thing." The hotel clerk had been listening. "You mean Orley Mattup, the guard? He got sick and said he had a hex on him, and took off one day, and a lot later they found him up on the mountain. He was dead." "Any money on him?" asked Danny. "Just some change. They buried it with him. They heard the hex was located into the money." "Congratulations," I told Danny. "I didn't think it'd work. You scared him to death." "Not quite," said Danny. "I scared him into hanging on to the money. That money would have killed anybody that carried it much longer than the few minutes I handled it. I'd been keeping the stuff in the reactor beam tubes. It was radioactive as hell."
Beyond the Door by Philip K. Dick. Larry Thomas bought a cuckoo clock for his wife without knowing the price he would have to pay. That night, at the dinner table, he brought it out and set it down beside her plate. Doris stared at it, her hand to her mouth. "My God, what is it?" She looked up at him, bright-eyed. "Well, open it." Doris tore the ribbon and paper from the square package with her sharp nails, her bosom rising and falling. Larry stood watching her as she lifted the lid. He lit a cigarette and leaned against the wall. "A cuckoo clock," Doris cried. "A real old cuckoo clock like my mother had." She turned the clock over and over, just like my mother had when Pete was still alive. Her eyes sparkled with tears. "It's made in Germany," Larry said. After a moment, he added, "Carl got it for me wholesale. He knows some guy in the clock business. Otherwise, I wouldn't have." He stopped. Doris made a funny little sound. I mean, otherwise I wouldn't have been able to afford it. He scowled. What's the matter with you? You've got your clock, haven't you? Isn't that what you want? Doris sat, holding on to the clock, her fingers pressed against the brown wood. Well, Larry said, what's the matter? He watched in amazement as she leaped up and ran from the room, still clutching the clock. He shook his head, never satisfied. They're all that way. Never get enough. He sat down at the table and finished his meal. The cuckoo clock was not very large. It was handmade, however, and there were countless frets on it, little indentations and ornaments scored in the soft wood. Doris sat on the bed, drying her eyes and winding the clock. She set the hands by her wristwatch. Presently, she carefully moved the hands to 2 minutes of 10. She carried the clock over to the dresser and propped it up. Then she sat, waiting, her hands twisted together in her lap, waiting for the cuckoo to come out, for the hour to strike. As she sat, she thought about Larry and what he had said, and what she had said too, for that matter. Not that she could be blamed for it. After all, she couldn't keep listening to him forever without defending herself. You had to blow your own trumpet in the world. She touched her handkerchief to her eyes suddenly. Why did he have to say that? About getting it wholesale? Why did he have to spoil it all? If he felt that way, he needn't have got it in the first place. She clenched her fists. He was so mean, so damn mean. But she was glad of the little clock sitting there, ticking to itself, with its funny grilled edges, and the door. Inside the door was the cuckoo waiting to come out. Was he listening? His head cocked on one side, listening to hear the clock strike so that he would know to come out. Did he sleep between hours? Well, she would soon see him. She could ask him, and she would show the clock to Bob. He would love it. Bob loved old things, even old stamps and buttons. He liked to go with her to the stores. Of course, it was a little awkward, but Larry had been staying at the office so much, and that helped. If only Larry didn't call up sometimes too. There was a whir. The clock shuddered, and all at once the door opened. The cuckoo came out, sliding swiftly. He paused and looked around solemnly, scrutinizing her, the room, the furniture. It was the first time he had seen her, she realized, smiling to herself in pleasure. She stood up, coming toward him shyly. Go on, she said. I'm waiting. The cuckoo opened his bill. He whirred and chirped quickly, rhythmically. Then, after a moment of contemplation, he retired. The door snapped shut. She was delighted. She clapped her hands and spun in a little circle. He was marvelous, perfect, and the way he had looked around, studying her, sizing her up, he liked her. She was certain of it, and she, of course, loved him at once, completely. He was just what she had hoped would come out of the little door. Doris went to the clock. She bent over the little door, her lips close to the wood. Do you hear me? She whispered. I think you're the most wonderful cuckoo in the world. She paused, embarrassed. I hope you'll like it here. Then she went downstairs again, slowly, her head high. Larry and the cuckoo clock really never got along well from the start. Doris said that it was because he didn't wind it right, and it didn't like being only half wound all the time. Larry turned the job of winding over to her. The cuckoo came out every quarter hour and ran the spring down without remorse, and someone had to be ever after it, winding it up again. Doris did her best, but she forgot a good deal of the time. Then Larry would throw his newspaper down with an elaborate, weary motion and stand up. He would go into the dining room, where the clock was mounted on the wall over the fireplace. He would take the clock down, and making sure that he had his thumb over the little door, he would wind it up. Why do you put your thumb over the door? Doris asked once. You're supposed to. She raised an eyebrow. Are you sure? I wonder if it isn't that you don't want him to come out while you're standing so close. Why not? Maybe you're afraid of him. Larry laughed. He put the clock back on the wall and gingerly removed his thumb. When Doris wasn't looking, he examined his thumb. There was still a trace of the nick cut out of the soft part of it. Who or what had pecked at him? One Saturday morning, when Larry was down at the office working over some important special accounts, Bob Chambers came to the front porch and rang the bell. Doris was taking a quick shower. She dried herself and slipped into her robe. When she opened the door, Bob stepped inside, grinning. "Hi," he said, looking around. "It's all right. Larry's at the office." "Fine." Bob gazed at her slim legs below the hem of the robe. "How nice you look today." She laughed. "Be careful. Maybe I shouldn't let you in after all." They looked at one another, half amused, half frightened. Presently, Bob said, "If you want, I'll—" "No, for God's sake." She caught hold of his sleeve. "Just get out of the doorway so I can close it. Mrs. Peters, across the street, you know." She closed the door. "And I want to show you something," she said. "You haven't seen it." He was interested. An antique or what? She took his arm, leading him toward the dining room. "You'll love it, Bobby." She stopped, wide-eyed. "I hope you will. You must love it. It means so much to me." "He means so much." "He?" Bob frowned. "Who is he?" Doris laughed. "You're jealous. Come on." A moment later, they stood before the clock, looking up at it. "He'll come out in a few minutes. Wait until you see him. I know you two will get along just fine." "What does Larry think of him?" "They don't like each other. Sometimes when Larry's here, he won't come out. Larry gets mad if he doesn't come out on time. He says—" "Says what?" Doris looked down. "He always says he's been robbed, even if he did get it wholesale." She brightened. "But I know he won't come out because he doesn't like Larry. When I'm here alone, he comes right out for me every 15 minutes, even though he really only has to come out on the hour." She gazed up at the clock. "He comes out for me because he wants to. We talk. I tell him things. Of course, I'd like to have him upstairs in my room, but it wouldn't be right." There was the sound of footsteps on the front porch. They looked at each other, horrified. Larry pushed the door open, grunting. He set his briefcase down and took off his hat. Then he saw Bob for the first time. "Chambers, I'll be damned." His eyes narrowed. "What are you doing here?" He came into the dining room. Doris drew her robe about her helplessly, backing away. Bob began. "This is... we..." He broke off, glancing at Doris. Suddenly, the clock began to whir. The cuckoo came rushing out, bursting into sound. Larry moved toward him. "Shut that din off," he said, raising his fist toward the clock. The cuckoo snapped into silence and retreated. The door closed. "That's better." Larry studied Doris and Bob, standing mutely together. "I came over to look at the clock," Bob said. "Doris told me that it's a rare antique, and that, nuts. I bought it myself." Larry walked up to him. "Get out of here." He turned to Doris. "You too, and take that damn clock with you." He paused, rubbing his chin. "No, leave the clock here. It's mine. I bought it and paid for it." In the weeks that followed after Doris left, Larry and the cuckoo clock got along even worse than before. For one thing, the cuckoo stayed inside most of the time, sometimes even at 12 o'clock when he should have been busiest. And if he did come out at all, he usually spoke only once or twice. never the correct number of times, and there was a sullen, uncooperative note in his voice, a jarring sound that made Larry uneasy and a little angry. But he kept the clock wound because the house was very still and quiet, and it got on his nerves not to hear someone running around, talking and dropping things, and even the whirring of the clock sounded good to him. But he didn't like the cuckoo at all, and sometimes he spoke to him. "Listen," he said late one night to the closed little door. "I know you can hear me. I ought to give you back to the Germans, back to the Black Forest." He paced back and forth. "I wonder what they're doing now. The two of them. That young punk with his books and his antiques. A man shouldn't be interested in antiques. That's for women." He set his jaw. "Isn't that right?" The clock said nothing. Larry walked up in front of it. "Isn't that right?" he demanded. "Don't you have anything to say?" He looked at the face of the clock. It was almost 11, just a few seconds before the hour. "All right, I'll wait until 11. Then I want to hear what you have to say. You've been pretty quiet the last few weeks since she left." He grinned wryly. "Maybe you don't like it here since she's gone." He scowled. "Well, I paid for you, and you're coming out whether you like it or not. You hear me?" 11 o'clock came. Far off at the end of town, the great tower clock boomed sleepily to itself, but the little door remained shut. Nothing moved. The minute hand passed on, and the cuckoo did not stir. He was someplace inside the clock, beyond the door, silent and remote. "All right, if that's the way you feel," Larry murmured, his lips twisting. "But it isn't fair. It's your job to come out. We all have to do things we don't like." He went unhappily into the kitchen and opened the great gleaming refrigerator. As he poured himself a drink, he thought about the clock. There was no doubt about it. The cuckoo should come out, Doris or no Doris. He had always liked her from the very start. They had got along well, the two of them. Probably he liked Bob too. Probably he had seen enough of Bob to get to know him. They would be quite happy together. Bob and Dolores and the cuckoo. Larry finished his drink. He opened the drawer at the sink and took out the hammer. He carried it carefully into the dining room. The clock was ticking gently to itself on the wall. "Look," he said, waving the hammer. "You know what I have here. You know what I'm going to do with it. I'm going to start on you first." He smiled. "Birds of a feather. That's what you are, the three of you." The room was silent. "Are you coming out, or do I have to come in and get you?" The clock whirred a little. "I hear you in there. You've got a lot of talking to do. Enough for the last 3 weeks. As I figure it, you owe me." The door opened. The cuckoo came out fast, straight at him. Larry was looking down, his brow wrinkled in thought. He glanced up, and the cuckoo caught him squarely in the eye. Down he went, hammer and chair and everything, hitting the floor with a tremendous crash. For a moment, the cuckoo paused, its small body poised rigidly. Then it went back inside its house. The door snapped tight shut after it. The man lay on the floor, stretched out grotesquely, his head bent over to one side. Nothing moved or stirred. The room was completely silent, except, of course, for the ticking of the clock. "I see," said Doris, her face tight. Bob put his arm around her, steadying her. "Doctor," Bob said, "can I ask you something?" "Of course," the doctor said. "Is it very easy to break your neck falling from so low a chair?" It wasn't very far to fall. I wonder if it might not have been an accident. Is there any chance it might have been suicide? The doctor rubbed his jaw. I never heard of anyone committing suicide that way. It was an accident, I'm positive. I don't mean suicide, Bob murmured under his breath, looking up at the clock on the wall. I meant something else, but no one heard him.
Death Makes a Mistake by William P. McGivern, read by Quartertone. When Reggie Van Fiddler sauntered into the cool, somber depths of the Midland Club's lobby, he was feeling in an exceptionally amiable mood. There was a song in his heart and a bland, dreamy, vague smile on his long, narrow face. This state of blissful tranquility could be attributed to the fact that Reggie's tan and white shoes were taking him directly toward the club bar, where he planned to while away the day sipping various long, cool drinks. And Reggie was always happy when the immediate future held the prospects of a drink. He nodded brightly to a uniformed attendant. "Glorious morning, isn't he?" he said. "It was a glorious morning," the attendant corrected politely. Reggie looked blankly at a clock on the wall, and a puzzled frown spread over his equine features. "Well, well," he muttered, shaking his head. "How'd that happen?" He sauntered on toward the bar, nibbling at a hangnail. The morning had slipped away from him somehow. Here it was 2 o'clock in the afternoon already. It was quite a blow. He remembered then that he had slept until 12:30, and he brightened considerably. That explained it. Whistling merrily, he strode on into the dim, cool bar with its heavy brown fixtures and solid atmosphere of masculinity. The bartender set up his usual drink, and with knowledge born of long experience, immediately began the preparation of a second. Reggie sipped his drink and relaxed. For several moments, he stood at the bar, lazily contented, his brain slowed to about 1 revolution per minute. Finally, he happened to glance toward the end of the bar, and he noticed a small, dark, narrow-eyed man watching him closely. Reggie smiled uncertainly and returned to his drink. The dark man at the end of the bar was the only other customer, and Reggie knew that he was not a member of the club, for he had never seen him before in his life. Reggie finished his drink, and when the bartender set another before him, he glanced again toward the end of the bar. The little dark man was still there, regarding him, it seemed, with a steady, fixed stare. Reggie coughed nervously and gulped his drink. There was something in the dark little man's beady-eyed gaze that disturbed him. He had another quick drink and peeked from the corner of his eye at the little dark man. There was something sinister about the chap, he felt sure. Reggie was the owner of an extremely lurid imagination, and now, warmed by the glow of alcohol, he began to envision all sorts of wild possibilities. After his 4th drink, he was certain that the man was an Axis agent. Just why an Axis agent would be staring at him, he had no idea, but he felt sure the man was a Nazi. Reggie finished his drink and set the glass on the bar. Then he casually sauntered toward the door. A few paces from the room's only exit, he paused, and under the pretense of inspecting a faded spot print on the wall, he sneaked a quick glance at the dark little man. The dark little man was still staring at him with narrowed, shaded eyes. Reggie yawned ostentatiously and inched closer to the door. He was going to make a break for it, but it would have to be fast and clever. His heart was pounding with more gusto than usual, and there were bright spots of excitement in his pale cheeks. This new role of dodging the Gestapo appealed enormously to his comic strip sense of melodrama. Headlines popped before his mind's eye. "Reggie Van Fiddler makes escape." From what he was going to escape, he wasn't quite sure, but he felt that the details would be in the body of the news story. Headlines didn't tell everything, did they? Within a foot of the door, he turned casually and took one last look at the little man who was staring so intently at him. Then, with a sudden, slithering motion, he slipped through the door. He collided heavily with a small figure. "I'm sorry," he stammered. "I'm in a bit of a hurry." He turned and started away, but he had barely taken 3 strides when he jerked to a stop. An expression of dazed amazement stole over his face, and his sleepy eyes opened wide. Wheeling suddenly, he stared back at the small figure he had collided with. The man was still standing in the corridor that led from the bar, regarding Reggie with a fixed, thoughtful expression. And he was the same dark little man Reggie had left inside the bar room seconds before. Reggie gulped audibly. His Adam's apple bobbed in his throat like a mouse in a sock. How had the dark little man gotten out of the bar ahead of him? Reggie didn't know, and he had no inclination to wait and ask questions. With one last incredulous look over his shoulder, he wheeled and loped across the lobby, down the marble steps, through the club's revolving doors, and into the street. He walked swiftly, mopping his forehead with his handkerchief. The experience had been an unnerving one. When he reached the end of the block, he hailed a cab and gave the driver the address of another bar. As the cab rolled across the loop, Reggie settled back and gnawed nervously at his fingernails. Thoughtful meditation and analysis were not his strongest suits. In fact, any thinking at all was an annoying chore to him, but he felt now that he had better bend his brain to the problem of the dark little man whom he'd seen at the club. The chap was obviously interested in him, but why? There was no reasonable answer to that question, and there was no explanation to the way the little fellow had popped up outside the bar when Reggie had seen him a split second before inside the bar. Reggie was still stewing over these matters when the cab came to a stop before a swanky glitter joint which catered to afternoon revelers and jitterbugs of both sexes. Inside the smoky, dimly lighted den of din and discord, Reggie forgot his troubles long enough to order a drink, his fifth of the afternoon. He was conscious of a vague buzzing between his ears, and there was a pleasant mellow glow in the region of his solar plexus. Had it not been for his disturbing experience at the Midland Club, he would have been feeling very, very fine. When his drink arrived, he sipped it appreciatively and glanced about the crowded bar, looking for a familiar face. In one corner of the room, he saw a tall young man in tweeds lounging against the wall with a drink in his hand. With a glad cry, Reggie scrambled from his bar stool and lurched across the crowded floor, weaving his way with drunken dexterity through the jitterbugging maniacs. "Hi!" he cried when he reached the tweed-clad young man's side. "How have you been, Ricky? Have a drink?" "Been fine," the young man answered. "Got a drink. Name isn't Ricky." "Not Ricky?" Reggie shook his head, frowning. "Could have sworn you were good old Ricky Davis, chap I knew at school. Well, how are things?" "Good," the young man answered. "Have a drink?" "Got one," Reggie said. "Got to go now. It's been nice seeing you again, Ricky." He started to weave his way back to the bar. Suddenly, he stopped, his eyes focusing in fascination on the figure of a man at the bar, a man who had appropriated the seat which Reggie had vacated. The man was small and dark. His eyes were narrow and inscrutable. He was the same person Reggie had seen at the club. The breath left Reggie's lungs in a rush. Obviously, the man had followed him here. As he stood, transfixed, in the middle of the floor, the man turned and looked straight at him, a peculiar, thoughtful expression on his dark face. After studying Reggie for a long interval, he turned slowly back to the bar. Reggie swallowed what was left of his drink in one gulp, but the liquor had no effect on him. After the shock he'd received, it would take liquid dynamite to bolster him up. He reeled back to the tall young man who was leaning against the wall. "Ricky!" he cried hoarsely. "I'm being followed! Axis agents are after me!" "Name isn't Ricky," the tall young man said. "Why?" "Why what?" Reggie said blankly. He seemed to have fumbled the conversational ball. He wished the young man would speak with more clarity and add a few articles and pronouns to his sentences. "Why are they following you?" the young man said peevishly. "Nothing better to do?" "That's just it," Reggie said. "I don't know why I'm being followed, but everywhere I go, this little man sticks to me like a postage stamp." "Where is he now?" Reggie pointed dramatically at the dark little man. "At the bar. He took the stool I left. He's right between that fat old man and that young girl with the red hair." The tweed-clad young man stared in the direction of Reggie's pointing finger, then he frowned and glanced down at Reggie. Any pink elephants yet? I'm not drunk, Reggie said indignantly. That man has been following me like a conga partner all afternoon. The tall young man patted Reggie patiently on the shoulder. Sleep and rest will make a new man of you, he said. Go home. Go to bed. You've got hallucinations. Hallucinations? Reggie cried over the din of the orchestra. What do you mean? Don't you see the man I mean? Right between the fat old man and the girl with the red hair? The tweedish young man shook his head. The stool between the fat old man and the red-haired girl is completely unoccupied, he said in the patient voice of a man instructing a very young child. Reggie shook his head bewilderedly. There was a sudden cold hollow in the pit of his stomach. He opened and closed his mouth several times without producing a sound. Are you serious? He finally managed to gasp. Certainly, the young man answered. There's no one on the bar stool you left. You're just seeing things. Take my advice and go home. You've had too much giggle water. Reggie set his drink down hastily. For a long, deliberate moment, he studied the back of the dark little man at the bar. Then he shook his head dazedly. Maybe this was all some wild product of his imagination. Maybe he was having hallucinations. He shook his head again, and then he shook hands with the young man in the tweed suit. I'm going home, Ricky, he said firmly. Say hello to the gang for me. Name isn't Ricky, the young man said, sipping from his drink. But I'll tell the boys you were asking. Good, Reggie said. He left the crowded bar by the back entrance. The warm sunshine was pleasant and reassuring. People hurried past him, traffic surged in the streets, and everything was quite normal. He breathed a deep sigh and hailed a cab. He gave the driver the address of his apartment and then settled back against the soft leather cushions. Sleep was all he needed. That was all. When he reached his apartment on the near north side, he had succeeded in convincing himself that his peculiar experiences of the afternoon were only products of his fevered imagination. As he let himself into his apartment, he had firmly resolved to strictly ration his reading of comic strips and spy magazines. They were pretty strong meat if they weren't handled with discretion. The pleasantly furnished living room of his apartment was shrouded in late afternoon semi-darkness, and when he closed and locked the door behind him, he switched on the lights. The first thing he saw when he walked into the room was the little dark man whom he'd seen at the club and at the bar a few minutes previously. The dark little man was sitting in a straight chair, his hands resting on his knees. There was a faint smile on his face as he studied Reggie with calm, inscrutable eyes. Reggie staggered back a few steps, clapping one hand hysterically to his forehead. He couldn't believe his eyes. He had left this man at a bar in the Loop, but here he was now, sitting calmly and unconcernedly in the living room of his apartment. "How did you get in here?" he gasped. The dark little man stood up and smiled. "Is that important?" he asked softly. "I am here, and that is all that matters." Reggie swallowed loudly. There was something disturbing about the calm ambiguity of the man's statement. He rubbed his damp palms together nervously. "Can I get you a drink?" he blurted. The dark little man shook his head slowly. Reggie looked at him uneasily, noticing him in detail for the first time. He was small, hardly more than 5'2", and he was slenderly built. His hair was jet black, and it combed straight back from a high, delicate forehead. He wore severely tailored black clothes that fit his small frame without a wrinkle. But his eyes dominated his entire personality, for they were a cold, chilling black, lusterless and unwinking, as unrevealing as twin diamonds. Reggie shivered slightly and looked wistfully toward the door of the apartment. He coughed nervously. "Sorry to seem rude," he said, laughing weakly, "but I've got to be toddling off now. It's been nice running into you. There are magazines on the table, liquor in the icebox, so just make yourself at home." He backed cautiously toward the door, smiling nervously. "Don't wait up for me," he said. "Wait," the dark little man said quietly. "I must talk with you." "Some other time," Reggie said, feeling behind him for the doorknob. "Awfully rushed just now. Sorry, but—" "Wait!" the little man said again, but this time his voice cracked like a whip. "Didn't you hear me? I must talk with you." Reggie jumped at the cracking tone of the man's voice. His hand jerked away from the doorknob as if it were red hot. "Oh, you want to talk to me?" he said foolishly. "I didn't understand you." "My name," the little man said, "is..." He paused and smiled cryptically. "Demise." "Glad to know you," Reggie said. "My name is..." "I know your name," Mr. Demise said. "I know everything about you, Reginald Van Fiddler. I know things about you that you don't know yourself." "Do you now?" Reggie said, becoming interested in spite of himself. "For instance?" "I know that you are about to take a long trip," Mr. Demise said. "That's not news," Reggie said. "My draft board just classified me 1A. I'll be taking a long trip very shortly." "That is not the trip I am referring to," Mr. Demise said. "You are going on a trip with me." Reggie blinked. He couldn't think of anyone with whom he would rather not take a trip than this dark, sinister little man who called himself Mr. Demise. What did demise mean, anyway? "It's nice of you and all that," he said, "but I don't think I'll be able to make it. My draft board might not like it." "They will understand," Mr. Demise said. "I don't know about that," Reggie said. He was beginning really to worry. There was something damnably inevitable about Mr. Demise's calm statements. "They're pretty ticklish about such things. I think we better forget the whole idea." "That is impossible," Mr. Demise said. Reggie rubbed his moist palms on his trouser legs. "Who are you?" he asked hesitantly. "Have you been following me around all day just to sell me on the idea of a trip? Are you from Cook's Tours?" Mr. Demise smiled and shook his head. "I am not interested in selling you the idea of a trip. I am simply telling you that you are going on a trip. I have already made all the arrangements. There is nothing that can possibly change them." "Where am I going?" Reggie asked. His voice was a whisper. "With me," Mr. Demise said. "That's no answer," Reggie said, clutching at straws. "Who are you? Where are you going?" Mr. Demise smiled again, very faintly. He walked slowly to the mantelpiece and plucked a rose from a vase. His hand gently closed over the flower as he turned to face Reggie. "Perhaps this will answer your questions," he said softly. He opened his hand and dropped the flower to the floor at Reggie's feet. Reggie's eyes widened in sheer amazement, for the soft, glowing beauty of the flower was faded forever. It lay on the floor, a blackened, dead reminder of its former glory. "It's dead," he said incredulously. "It withered at the touch of your hand." Mr. Demise nodded slowly, and there was a wistful sadness in his face. "All living things die at my touch," he said, "for I am death." "Death?" Reggie echoed. For an instant, he stared blankly at Mr. Demise. "Death?" he repeated. "Why, that's the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard." He actually felt a sensation of relief in the realization that he'd been entertaining some loony instead of an Axis agent, as he'd feared. "You're off your trolley," he said to Mr. Demise. "You'd better get moving before your keeper finds you. Death! What a gag!" "I assure you it is not a gag," Mr. Demise said slowly. "Your time is near at hand, and I have been sent to take you to the land of darkness." "Think again, chum," Reggie said emphatically. "I'm not going to Harlem with you or anyone else, and that's final." "It is useless to protest," Mr. Demise said. "Your destiny is sealed. You must come with me." "You are plain balmy," Reggie said. "I've never heard a sillier yarn in my life. So you're Death, are you?" Mr. Demise nodded. "I am one of his agents." "Changing your story a little, aren't you?" Reggie said triumphantly. "Well, since when has death been announced by personal messengers? A man steps in front of a car, he's killed. That's all there is to it. There aren't little black men standing on the curb pushing him into the street, are there? and they don't come around a couple of hours in advance, tipping him off, do they? No.
When a mortal passes over, Mr. Demise said, there is always an agent of death present superintending the details. But he is not always visible to his charge.
Reggie poured himself a drink and lit a cigarette. Well, thanks just the same, he said, but I don't want any special effects when I pass over. If there's a messenger of death around, I don't want to see him. Just let him stay invisible. That's the way I want it. Mr. Demise looked slightly pained. There was an embarrassed look on his normally expressionless features.
Usually, the agent of death is invisible, he said. In fact, his orders are to remain invisible under all circumstances.
Okay then, Reggie said. You're breaking orders. Be a nice, obedient chum now and fade away. Mr. Demise shrugged and stepped backwards, and suddenly he was gone. He had disappeared into thin air, soundlessly, instantaneously. Why, what? Reggie said blandly. He started to sip his drink, when suddenly the full realization of what had happened burst on him. The drink fell from his nerveless fingers with a crash. He stared frantically about the room. Mr. Demise was gone. It was incredible. It was unbelievable. But it was a fact. He poured himself another drink and drained it in one breathless gulp. He felt his reason tottering as his gaze swung desperately about the room. Mr. Demise, he cried, come back! Where are you?
I am here before you.
Mr. Demise's voice sounded in the air.
Are you convinced now?
Reggie mopped his forehead weakly. Yes, he gasped. I'm convinced. Mr. Demise reappeared as suddenly as he had vanished. He smiled faintly at Reggie. He was apparently completely unruffled by his transformation. Reggie poured himself another drink with trembling fingers. Don't do that anymore, he pleaded.
As you wish,
Mr. Demise said agreeably.
I am sorry if I shocked you. I can see now that it was a mistake to let you see me in the first place. I understand now why it is strictly forbidden.
Reggie drained his drink. I wish you hadn't decided to break regulations, he said moodily. I've never been so upset in all my life. Why didn't you remain invisible if you're supposed to? You aren't going to creep into people's hearts if you pop up and announce yourself as an agent of death and start making speeches about whisking them off to the land of darkness. People just don't like that sort of thing. By all means, stay invisible in the future. Mr. Demise shuffled awkwardly, and for the first time, his poise seemed to desert him.
You're absolutely right, he said gloomily. But I was curious.
That's a fine excuse, Reggie said scathingly. I should think they'd get a man of tact and diplomacy for your job, not some nosy person whose curiosity runs away with him.
You see,
Mr. Demise explained miserably.
You happen to be my first assignment. I've had no experience at all in this work, and I was curious to see what kind of person I was going to take back with me. And I wanted to get a first-hand reaction from you.
Reggie mixed himself another drink. He was beginning to feel belligerent. So? He cried. They sent an amateur down to get me, did they? I suppose I don't rate an experienced escort, so they sent you. I'm surprised they didn't just tell the office boy to do the job.
Your levity is poor taste,
Mr. Demise observed frigidly.
I can assure you that I am perfectly qualified to act as your guide to the other world. I have studied hard to perfect myself for my work, and I was considered one of the outstanding pupils in the class which just graduated. You do not have to relieve your spite by making slighting references to my professional ability.
Bah, Reggie said. If you have any professional ability, it hasn't been noticeable so far. You're just out of some college, aren't you? You talk like a college boy. You don't make sense. Mr. Demise looked hurt.
I'm sorry you're taking this attitude, he said. I had hoped we could be friends.
Friends? Reggie shrieked. Am I expected to be friendly with some ghoul who comes prowling around, threatening to whisk me off to eternity? What more do they expect of me? To pay my own way, too, I suppose?
Your passage will be taken care of at the other end,
Mr. Demise said.
Since you have taken such an ungracious stand, we will not dally further.
Now, wait a minute, Reggie said. He felt his throat getting dry. The prospects of death were not pleasant. He didn't want to die right now. He had things to do. There was that badminton match next week with Snuffy Smith. Can't we put this thing off a while? He asked hopefully. There's no sense in rushing things, I always say. Why don't you go off and get yourself a lot of experience, and then come back for me?
That is impossible,
Mr. Demise said flatly. He drew from his inside coat pocket a slim black book which he opened to the first page.
You are first on my list, and I must carry out my orders to the letter. All the information as to person, place, and method is contained in this book, and it would be impossible to change it.
Place and method, eh? Reggie said weakly. He ran a finger around the inside of his collar. You mean you've got the dope there on how it's going to happen and when it's going to happen?
Certainly,
Mr. Demise replied.
We don't use a hit-or-miss method. Everything is worked out to a science. You, for instance, are...
Mr. Demise paused and shook his head.
No, he continued, I can't tell you. That is also against instructions.
You haven't paid much attention to instructions so far, Reggie said sulkily. Can't you give me a hint as to how I'm going to get it? Mr. Demise shook his head firmly.
That would be an unthinkable breach of conduct,
he said, shaking his head severely and frowning.
Absolutely unthinkable.
All right, Reggie said resignedly. There was no point, he realized, in arguing with this inhuman icicle. But let's have a drink before we get down to, business.
I am not allowed to drink while on duty,
Mr. Demise said primly. For gosh sakes, Reggie said disgustedly. You weren't thinking about your precious orders and regulations when you followed me around, scaring the hell out of me. Oh no, that was all right. But when I ask you to do a little something outside the letter of your instructions, it's no soap. If there's anything fair in that, I can't see it. Mr. Demise shuffled uncomfortably.
It was indiscreet of me to allow you to see me,
he said thoughtfully.
Perhaps your objection is justifiable. It might square things a bit if I would take a drink with you. Not that I would expect to enjoy this stuff, but it seems the fair thing to do.
Fine, Reggie said. He mixed 2 drinks in somber silence. Because he realized that it was probably the last time he would ever perform that pleasant chore, he put his heart and soul into the task, and when he finally handed Mr. Demise his drink, it was a veritable masterpiece. Mr. Demise drank the drink. It was a double martini with a splash of Cointreau, in one long, appreciative gulp. He set the glass down and sighed contentedly. Another? Reggie suggested hopefully.
No,
Mr. Demise said.
1 is plenty. As a matter of fact,
he said,
that's the first drink I've ever had. Alcohol is one of our finest helpers, but we aren't supposed to touch it. Personally, I think its intoxicating effect is greatly overrated.
Reggie leaned forward, and there was a peculiar gleam in his eyes. So that was your first drink, eh? He asked. And you don't feel anything?
Not a thing,
said Mr. Demise.
Of course, I notice a certain glow, but that's all.
Just a certain glow, eh? Reggie said.
That's all,
Mr. Demise said. He sat down suddenly.
And my tongue is a little thick.
Well, that's only natural, Reggie said. He mixed another drink, and there was a cryptic smile on his lips. Alcohol is a peculiar thing. One drink will addle a person's wits, and the second will act as an antidote. Strange, isn't it? Mr. Demise rocked slightly in the chair. His coal-black eyes were a bit glazed.
It's very strange,
He conceded. Possibly you'd like to try the antidote? Reggie said casually.
Might not be a bad idea,
Said Mr. Demise. Reggie handed him the second drink and watched contentedly as Mr. Demise drank it down. Mr. Demise set down the glass.
You was right.
He said, slumping against the back of the chair.
Absolutely right. Second drink is an antidote. Just what I needed.
Absolutely, Reggie agreed solemnly. Mr. Demise closed his eyes, but he opened them almost immediately. He struggled up to a sitting position.
I have something to do,
He muttered. His hand groped into the inside of his coat, returned with a slim black book.
Very important.
He mumbled.
First assignment. Can't have any slip-ups.
Reggie moistened his lips nervously. He eyed the little black book carefully. That might be the way. How about another drink, old boy? He said heartily. He mixed one quickly, handed it to Mr. Demise. Mr. Demise took it in his left hand, and Reggie deftly plucked the black book from his right hand. Mr. Demise appeared not to notice the exchange. He drank the drink methodically. Reggie tossed the book under a coffee table. Mr. Demise climbed unsteadily to his feet. Reggie took him by the arm. What say we go out and have a few antidotes? He suggested. Mr. Demise nodded stupidly. He mumbled something unintelligible and allowed Reggie to lead him to the door. Reggie's brain was working at full speed. If he could just ditch Mr. Demise and get back to the book, everything might be saved. His idea was sheer brilliance. Their first destination was a bar. Reggie found a cab, shoved Mr. Demise inside, and ordered the driver to one of the dozens of friendly bars with which she was familiar. At the first stop, Mr. Demise had 2 more drinks. When he had drained the second, Reggie hauled him to his feet and started for another pallet palace. His object was to keep Mr. Demise so bewildered and drunk that he would forget his job. For a while he succeeded. Mr. Demise followed him helplessly from bar to bar and sat tottering on high stools, happily pouring fiery intoxicants into his already overburdened stomach. But finally, he reached a state of saturation where the liquor produced a steadily diminishing effect. Reggie watched him worriedly and ordered more and more drinks. But it was no use. In spite of the enormous quantities of liquor he had consumed, Mr. Demise was slowly sobering up. His face was losing its blank expression, and an intelligent gleam was creeping back into his eyes. He began to fumble uncertainly through his pockets, a worried expression settling over his features. Reggie slapped him on the back resoundingly. "Have a drink!" he shouted into his ear. Mr. Demise shook his head stubbornly.
Got a job to do,
He muttered. He went slowly through his pockets, and an expression of horror replaced the worried look on his face.
Where's my book?
He gasped.
I've lost my book. This is terrible. I've got to find it.
What book? Reggie asked innocently.
The book with all the names and places and dates and methods.
Mr. Demise moaned.
I've lost it.
Reggie shrugged philosophically. Too bad, he said. But things are never as black as they seem. Maybe it'll turn up somewhere. The first thing to do is just sit tight until someone finds it and reports it.
I can't wait,
wailed Mr. Demise.
These things have to happen on schedule. There'd be an awful rumpus in the complaint department if I started sending people up there haphazardly. And I don't even remember whom I've got on the list. You're the only one I'm sure of.
Reggie choked on his drink.
Yes,
Mr. Demise went on obliviously.
You're the first. I'm sure of that much. And I'd better send you along right away. I'll do that much correctly, at least.
Now, just a minute, Reggie said. How are you sure you've got me right? I looked at that book, and I don't think I'm the man you want at all."
"You looked at the book?"
cried Mr. Demise with sudden suspicion.
"So that's where it went. That's why you got me drunk. You stole my book, hoping to evade your destiny, didn't you?"
"Nothing of the sort," Reggie said, forcing a note of outraged indignation into his voice.
"Yes, you did,"
Mr. Demise said.
"I'm not going to wait a second longer in your case. Mr. Fiddler, prepare yourself for a long trip and don't plan on coming back."
Reggie realized that the jig was up. Mr. Demise had a grim, businesslike note in his voice, and there was no hope of prolonging things further. Drastic action was needed, not discussion. With a leap like a startled gazelle, Reggie left his stool and bounded for the door. Before Mr. Demise could turn around, he was in the street, shouting frantically for a cab. A cab pulled to the curb, and Reggie leaped into its dark interior. Over his shoulder, he saw Mr. Demise stagger from the bar, a wrathful expression stamped on his dark features. The cab started away with a roar. Reggie shouted his address at the driver and squirmed about to peek out the rear window. He saw Mr. Demise clambering into another cab. "Hurry!" he shouted to the driver.
"Life or death, eh?"
the cabbie said conversationally. Reggie winced. "You said it!" The cab caromed around corners, hit the outer drive, and hurled along like a frightened cottontail until it reached the near north side, where it swung west and sped through the labyrinthine streets that led to Reggie's apartment. From the rear window, Reggie could see Mr. Demise's cab speeding after them, steadily closing the gap. His palms were moist, and the effects of the liquor had completely faded, leaving him horribly sober. There was nothing funny about this predicament. His cab jolted to a stop, and Reggie threw a bill at the driver and leaped out and raced into the foyer of his building. By a miraculous stroke of luck, the elevator was not in use. He slammed the door and jabbed the button, and the car started upward with a jerk. He breathed a long, shuddering sigh of relief. Maybe there would yet be time. The elevator stopped at his floor. Just as he opened the door and stepped out, the elevator suddenly dropped back down the shaft. One of his legs dangled down the shaft. With a startled squawk, he pulled himself onto the floor landing. Mr. Demise obviously meant business. If he'd been in that elevator, everything would be all over now. As it was, he still had a chance. He let himself into his apartment, switched on the light, and dove underneath the coffee table. The Black Book of Doom was still there. Frantically, Reggie opened it to the first page, found his own name. He jerked a pencil from his pocket. He was still scribbling furiously when the door of the apartment banged open and Mr. Demise strode into the room, his face black as a thundercloud. Reggie dropped the pencil and hid the book from view with his body.
"So,"
Mr. Demise cried.
"you would try to escape?"
He raised both hands commandingly in the air. Before he could move again, Reggie wheeled about. "Just a minute!" he shrieked. He held out the slim black book to Mr. Demise. "I was sure a mistake had been made. Here, look for yourself."
"I want no more of your tricks,"
Mr. Demise warned ominously. "This is no trick," Reggie said. "You should be grateful to me for catching the error in time." Mr. Demise took the book from Reggie and examined it carefully. The frown gradually faded from his face as his eyes lingered on the page. He shuffled his feet awkwardly and cleared his throat.
"It seems,"
he said in a small, chastened voice,
"that a mistake has been made."
Reggie's heart pounded with hope. "It certainly has," he said. "This entire affair should be reported to someone. That's what happens when you put inexperienced men on the job. You wind up with a bungled mess."
"I don't know how it happened,"
Mr. Demise said miserably.
"All I can say is I'm sorry."
"Fine thing," Reggie said stuffily. "Mess up your job like this, and then say you're sorry. I'd advise, Demise, that you lay off the liquor when you're supposed to be working."
"I will in the future,"
Mr. Demise said humbly. See that you do, Reggie said sternly. Now I'd say you'd better get to work on that first assignment.
Yes, I will,
Mr. Demise said. With drooping shoulders, he moved slowly to the door. With his hand on the knob, he turned again to Reggie.
I hate to be a pest, he said, but I'm afraid I don't know how to go about this job. Maybe you could help me. Where can I find this fellow?
Reggie chuckled and began to mix himself a drink. I'd advise you to try Berchtesgaden, he said. Just ask anyone you meet. They'll tell you where you can find Adolf Hitler.
Thank you,
Mr. Demise said gratefully.
I won't slip up on this one.
See that you don't, Reggie said,